Okay, Shay, what do you think, Varun? Should we start?
Hi,
Yeah,
Varun.
it's
Nice to meet you.
hello, it's so nice to meet you as well. So I'll just give an introduction of
Yeah,
myself.
good to see you.
Uh, I'm
Sure.
Varun. I've just joined the Coexistence Consortium as the communications coordinator, and I'm very much looking forward to working in this field. Um, I've been working as a science communicator for about a year or so. Last year, I was working in the field of neuroscience and art, and I'm very looking forward to getting into the field of conservation. And this field just means a lot to me. So, yeah. I'm very happy to be here.
You were working in the field of neuroscience and art.
Yeah, so the organization that I work for was called Arisa Foundation, and they basically studied how different art forms affect your brain and
I
how we can
see.
include art in our daily lives to increase well-being.
All right, very nice. Why
Yeah,
don't you
it was
give
very
a talk
interesting.
sometime? Give a
Yeah, I
coexistence
think we
talk
definitely
sometime.
should. That
Yeah,
would
that
be
would
good,
be
yeah.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Sure.
just like getting into the thick of it, but as soon as I'm like used to everything, I would love to.
Wonderful. What's your
Yeah.
background? What have you studied earlier?
Yeah, so initially I was studying astrophysics
Okay.
in Boston University, but
Okay.
then COVID happened, so I had to shift back to India. And then I wanted to shift my field a bit to include a bit more arts. So I studied journalism and mass communication, and then at the end of it, I was like, I need to combine both of my interests. So science and journalism and communication. So science communication was what I ended up with.
Great.
Very nice. Wonderful. Good luck
Yes.
for the future.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll just give an introduction about ourselves and what Coexistence Consortium does before we begin our talk. So we're a network of conservation researchers and practitioners from diverse disciplines, united by a common vision, which is to understand the intricate dynamics of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Our mission extends beyond the conservation of just wild animals confined to distant forests. We emphasize the importance of living well with nature, even in our immediate surroundings. Our collective long-term vision is to employ an experimental and evidence-based approach to catalyze the variety of human-wildlife coexistence projects worldwide. So about the structure of our webinar, our speaker will be presenting for around 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session. I'll now invite Seema who is a Coexistence Consortium member, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Hi everyone. Uh, so I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce Tash's full name because it's very difficult and I'm going to get it wrong as usual. So yeah, Tash is like first and foremost, it's a pleasure to introduce him. He first and foremost is a really good friend of mine. And also on top of it, he's a researcher and a conservationist interested in more human inclusive models of nature conservation. He has co-founded the Shola Trust in 2008 and worked with the Real Elephant Collective, a social enterprise, in 2015. Currently, he is an associate professor at the Center of Human and Wildlife Coexistence at TDU, that is the Transdisciplinary University. His area of research and intervention include the work on lantana camera, primarily looking at how communities can use this invasive plant in various ways. If you see those beautiful elephants that are made all across and in Bangalore airport, Terminal 2. So one of those initiatives is done by Tash. So that's something that we are very happy about. He's also preliminary interested in how people and elephants share space and finding ways to minimize negative interactions. His work has been based mostly in southern India, in Nilgiri's Biosphere Reserve, across Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka. And he's keen at promoting human-wildlife coexistence at more national and global scales. Tash, on to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Seema. Yeah, for that very generous introduction. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all here. So I'm keeping this talk quite informal. I'm not actually going to run through much of a slideshow. I have few videos that I'll show you to kind of illustrate some points that I'm talking about. But I'm trying to kind of make a point without the power of PowerPoint. To experiment and actually just being able to talk and try to communicate ideas. So if anyone feels up to it and is in a position to turn on videos, you're very welcome to. The idea is to actually see everybody and chat. I'm not higher through. Yeah, and it's also there. I mean, if we can also stop and kind of have discussions in between, If anyone feels up to it, I'll try to ask certain questions, and it's not necessarily rhetorical. If anybody wants to answer, please feel free to jump in. Or alternatively, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to, and we'll keep going on. I understand that it's quite hard for people to sit and fully engage the talk. A lot of talks we now listen to in the background while we're doing other things, but you can maybe also do that. Right, so I'll start with a video that kind of talks about the elephant personalities in Gudalur or in the Nilgiris that were part of my PhD fieldwork. And then we'll talk more about this. It's always good to start an elephant talk with something is going on here. It's always good to start an elephant talk with seeing elephants. Is the screen visible?
Yep.
Yes, we can see it.
And can you hear some music and video?
Yep.
The Gudalur Elephant Monitoring Project started in 2015 to better understand the diversity in the elephants and how they were all different from each other in terms of how they interact with people. First, the elephants that we see very few times in the year, they're kind of transient. They move through the landscape but are not resident in Gudalur. The second are elephants that we see regularly, so they are resident, but they are shy and they never come near human habitation. Third are kind of what we call brash youngsters. They come near human habitation, come into towns a lot, but they are not comfortable around people and they exhibit the standard physiological response of fight or flight. They either charge at the people and attack or they run away. And the fourth are perhaps most interesting, are highly habituated older males that they don't do anything, no matter what people do and how much people throw firecrackers at them, beat drums, chase them on with vehicles. They're just not frazzled at all. They never attack the people and they never run away or go away from people. So what we found in Gudalur is that the transient elephants that are moving through and not resident, the resident but shy elephants that don't come near people, these constitute 80% of the population. And these aren't really causing any trouble for people, they're not interacting with people. It's the 10% brash youngsters that are actually doing all the damage. Even the 10% of highly habituated males, they've learned not to attack people and there is very minimal damage from them. So with 80% of elephant home range in India outside protected areas, there is an urgent need to understand this space better and the elephants in terms of how they are different from each other. Not all elephants are the same and there is no one solution for problems with elephants.
Thanks. So I think many of you sorry, may have seen a version of the same video. It's at the bottom of most of my emails. So apologies for that repeat, but I just thought it's nice to kind of actually see the elephants and get a sense of what that landscape is like. So the thing I'm trying to focus on here is this whole idea of interdisciplinarity and how I argue that elephants are doing a great job in kind of bridging this divide just by virtue of who they are. And how they interact with people and the certain kind of forced connections they force us humans to make, right? So I start with this idea of interdisciplinarity itself. What do most of you think interdisciplinary means? Is it kind of a combination of natural science and social science, or something else? How would anybody define interdisciplinarity almost? Between what are the two disciplines? Well, if there's nothing, I think for most people, it usually is this idea of the natural sciences and the social sciences. But then when you dig deeper, the question is, what is natural science and what is social science? Is natural science everything that has to deal with nature and social science everything to deal with people, right? Is that a fair kind of assessment of how people classify these sciences? I'll assume so. And in which case, what happens is that that gets a little complicated because there are people like, say, a Man Barua, or increasingly so an Anandya Rana Sinha, who study animals to a large extent, but not in natural science terms, right? There's something different. Man, for example, why does he, what does he write about elephants? He's a very good friend of ours who studied we all studied together, and he said, I love reading. I mean, I see all your papers and I read them, but I have to say I can't understand much of what's written in them, though they're in English. That kind of engagement with animals that is happening with human geographers is slightly outside the realm and very different from the kind of engagement that natural science engages with people, with animals, right? And similarly, you'll find there are lots of kind of psychologists who are dealing with a lot of hard data when they're dealing with people, right? And so, what is the difference really, and where do you draw this line? And I think that is the big challenge, which I think is not well enough understood in these sciences. Um, so, it starts with the question of how do you know the world? How do you try to understand the world? Right? What constitutes legitimate knowledge? I'm going to take a kind of step back here and almost talk through the history of how knowledge creation happened around, not around the world, in the West actually. Um, from my perspective, how I try to understand it in terms of how I was doing my PhD and the research afterwards. So, in most Western systems, one of the earliest ideas was that knowledge comes from the Bible, the whole idea of hermeneutics or theism, where the scholars of the day were those who read the Bible and kind of interpreted it and formed knowledge of that, of trying to understand that, right? That continues today as well, to some extent, within kind of religious fields. It's not just maybe the Bible. I'm sure other religions also have that form of knowledge creation, where you read some text and interpret it, and that is knowledge. Then you had, of course, all your classical Greek philosophers, the whole idea of metaphysics, that if you could make a good argument, if you could reason, if you could talk through something, that was what was knowledge. That was how you created knowledge. The great debaters who would sit and talk for hours and hours and generate knowledge through talking, right? And almost in response to that, you had Comte's idea of positivism, that knowledge has to be based on some observation of some empirical information. It wasn't yet data in the early days when it started, but knowledge was created through empiricism. You had to observe something in the world to create new knowledge. And that almost kind of over time evolved into the scientific method as we know it today. So you have a kind of hypothesis based on some idea. You do an experiment to test that hypothesis. Based on that, you accept or reject your hypothesis and modify it. And that circle of knowledge creation continues. Now, the thing is that this isn't as straightforward as it seems. Because first you have this whole idea of indigenous knowledge that all of us are very keen on. All of us kind of accept, oh, we should incorporate indigenous knowledge. But the idea of how indigenous knowledge is created is fundamentally at odds, in some sense, with the scientific method, where there isn't necessarily observation. It's kind of accumulated over generations and passed on. A lot of it is anecdotal and taken for granted. A lot of it is something that we just may not agree with. So the idea of, say, that a fire is a person and has personhood, and a fire is a person who visits the forest and does something and goes away. Those kind of ideas are quite hard to kind of mesh with the natural world. And I think that tension is something that is not explored enough. But the important thing is that this tension is not only between, say, indigenous knowledge, anthropology, and biology or ecology. It exists even within the sciences. So in physics, for example, knowledge is only created through experiment, right? Or the bulk of all knowledge in physics, the hardest of the sciences, you have to do an experiment, and that experimental result is really important. And immediately they look at ecology as almost a stepbrother or sibling, because there is very little experiment in ecology. It's largely observational. It's largely correlation, right? And we all kind of know that correlation isn't always causation, but that's the best we can do. We cannot really do experiments in the natural world, so we rely for the most part um, on observation. And that observation is kind of codified, put into some shape or form, and some analysis is run on it. But we're not doing experiments. So these tensions between the sciences, I think, remain. And the idea is that when you choose a discipline, you define the boundaries of it for yourself, and you kind of reject others. And that rejection very often causes a lot of friction in terms of what we consider knowledge. And that's what I'm trying to build on a little bit with the idea of how elephants are dealing with this space. So in conservation, all of us kind of are very excited by this idea of conservation science. But if you ask a little more, what is conservation science? I've always kind of hit a wall. Like, what is a science and how do you define a discipline? What are the rules of that discipline? But conservation is not a kind of area of study. Conservation is a practice. So there has been some literature on this, on almost suggesting that there's no such a thing as a discipline of conservation. Conservation is a practice that should be influenced by multiple disciplines, such as uh, anthropology, traditional knowledge, STS, ecology, biology, of course. So it should be multiple fields of study that influence the practice of conservation. And we should not think of conservation as a science or a discipline. But unfortunately, we do. We have a lot of conservation journals who call themselves conservation journals. And we assume this is a kind of science and a discipline itself. And we create a lot of false boundaries for ourselves and then make it quite hard to come to terms with what constitutes legitimate knowledge. So there's a nice paper on this by somebody called Maxney, 2005, I think. And there's also another very interesting paper on this by Bill Adams and Chris Sandbrook that talk about the idea of social sciences, and the motivations for social sciences are very often not to solve conservation problems. That's where a lot of tension arises. Social scientists very often want to study the process of conservation like they study anything else, capitalism or any other process past or anything in society, to gain insights into how that process is working. Their objective is not to promote conservation, or they're not upfront about wanting to help the cause of conservation, which is again a practice, not necessarily a discipline. So that's a very interesting point. Now they classify social science for conservation, which in some cases people are trying to solve a problem that is hindering the practice of conservation. But in other cases, it is social science of conservation, in better trying to understand conservation as a social process, right? So I think this kind of background is quite interesting, has been really interesting for me and fascinating in how I've been studying this. And I'll jump into the idea of elephants. Why I argue that elephants kind of break down all these barriers for us automatically as you kind of engage with understanding elephants. So I'm going to kind of try to pick up on some social science terms almost and explain them elephant uh, in elephant worlds almost. So first is the idea of ontology. Is everyone aware of ontology and what natural social scientists mean by it? The biggest challenge here is that all of these words mean different things to different people. Ontology means very different things in kind of subdisciplines of the social sciences. So if anybody wants to jump in, feel free, raise your hand. I think I can see most people, and I'm happy to kind of have a bit of a dialogue or chat here about it. But I understand ontology as, I mean, I kind of remember what ontology means, largely in terms of what is something, right? It's a very fundamental question. So if you ask the question, what is an elephant? Can an elephant be defined entirely by its biological attributes? Everyone will agree, yeah, it can. I mean, it has a certain digestive system, it has certain skin, it has ears, it has certain features, but there's huge variability in that, right? But there is that very famous anecdote that has been repeated multiple times. Also recently wrote about it in an article as well. If you put 5 blind men or 10 blind men to describe an elephant, you will see they all describe different things, right? And that is the idea of ontology, which is very relevant when an elephant interacts with the world. An elephant in absolute terms, disconnected from the world, may be clearly definable. But if you take a zoo elephant, for example, or a temple elephant that has never lived outside of a certain kind of enclosure in a certain kind of space, it is completely different from an elephant of the wild. Like I remember a temple elephant that was brought to Mudumalai once, could not walk on uneven ground, could not go down to the river and drink from the river. You have to give it water in the bucket, only then it will drink. It would not pick up wild fodder and eat. You have to cut it and give it, only then it will eat, right? So this elephant is completely different from the elephant we talk about in conflict. The elephant who's going to great lengths to overcome a barrier, for example, all of that. And this, I think all of us will agree. I don't think there's much debate here. A zoo wild elephant, a zoo or a wild elephant versus say an elephant in the camp, there's a gradient of, we can kind of classify it along different things, along how intelligent the elephant is, how much it engages. Seema's work on acoustics, for example, she can't even do in a camp because they are not communicating or verbalizing as much. There isn't much sound happening with camp elephants. So it's no point studying elephant acoustics in a camp. So if you're an elephant acoustics kind of specialist, again, that elephant is, which elephant it is, becomes very important. And though these are biologically the same elephant, you cannot actually study them in the same way. So again, that's almost my first case study of how elephants are make a very easy case for us to accept this idea of ontology, and that the same biological elephant is very different in different cases. But if you move on to, say, indigenous people and how they visualize elephants, there's this idea of other than human persons. I'm not sure if you've come across it. It's been studied, and it's remarkably similar with hunter-gatherer communities everywhere in the world, that they think of most aspects of nature and natural phenomena, like the sun and the moon, the wind, fire I mentioned, as other than human persons, which means they have a soul, they have reasoning. You expect mutualism. If you behave well, the fire will behave well back to you. If basically you can have a relationship with it, with the fire or with the elephant or with any individual of the animal. And the individual is really important. Not all elephants are the same. Some elephants are other than human persons. Some elephants are not. They're just an elephant. Some stones are devrus. For example, Patanakans call it devru. It's not really God in the traditional sense, but you can have an ana devru or a snake devru or a stone devru or a tree devru, which is a tree person or a elephant person or a stone person. But that doesn't mean all trees and all stones you can have relationships with and interact with on equal terms as you do with people. Now, this idea, when you first hear about it, people think it's a bit strange, right? How can you kind of think of the fire as a person or the air and the wind? But when it comes to elephants, again, I find it's quite easy for people to agree that elephants are all individual. They're very different in how they react to us. I mean, that was the point of my PhD, what came up in that video as well. And you see some cutting edge scientists, ethologists who are studying elephant behavior come up with ideas about elephant behavior or decision making being largely based on idiosyncratic individuals. This is, of course, Rana I'm referring to, and Nishant, and all of their work with elephants outside Bangalore. So when you observe elephants for a long time and try to understand decision making, you find that they're not driven solely by kind of Darwinian ideas about food, reproductive success, and water. There is this whole idea of personality and individuality. And that is very similar to the indigenous Adivasi ontology almost of what is an elephant. So again, this whole question of, is an elephant a thinking sentient being that is making decisions based on cognitive processes and thought, things like that, or is it of what social scientists sometimes call Darwinian automatons, that you can explain all of their behavior through the idea of reproductive success, food, and water. And this is not just elephants. I'm sure you'll all know of E.O. Wilson's famous book on sociobiology, where he argues that you can kind of explain all human behavior in this framework as well. If you are kind of eating food out of your partner's plate at a restaurant, it's almost to test the fitness of your partner, and will your partner be strong enough to provide enough food that you can always take some food out. So these are the kind of underlying drivers for these kind of behaviors of why you pick food from your partner's plate, but your partner gets irritated and say you order your own food and eat it, right? So that is a bit of a stretch. You can extend this idea of sociobiology, that all behavior can be explained in this Darwinian framework to any length. But is that the only way of kind of explaining all this behavior and variability? Is another key kind of variable, or key unknown, I would say. Sorry, not a variable. So it's again a choice that we have to make in terms of how you interpret all of this behavior of elephants, and how do you understand personality and individuality. Because biology, for the most part, frowns on giving the idea of personality. Even for a long time, I wouldn't call it personality. I would only call it behavioral characteristics or behavioral categories. Because personality is defined by some biologists as inheritable traits that, the fixed behavioral traits that are passed on from one generation to another. That's a very limited idea of personality if you think of it in human terms. Do we think that our personality is entirely shaped by what was passed on, or how much of it is kind of socially learned, and all of that is a big deal. So again, elephants, I would argue, are a great way of exploring all of these ideas deeper. And it's very visible and obvious. Anybody who interacts with elephants, kind of all this comes up right up to your face almost. You cannot ignore these deeper questions around elephants. The next idea is one of agency. And again, agency means different things in different disciplines. But I kind of understand agency as the ability of an animal to make decisions that are not very constrained, make kind of free decisions. And the decisions and the actions have an impact on the world, not just any beings, right? So you have agency if you have certain freedom in the way you can express yourself, make decisions. And the decisions and actions you do has an impact on the world. Now, do animals have agency, for example, is a large question that is debated quite a bit. And again, with elephants, the question is obvious, right? We make all these plans of how we're going to save elephants, or we'll keep elephants in these spaces, those spaces, but elephants are making their own plans, right? I'll show you another quick video. Is the video visible?
Yes, it is.
Great. So this is a very kind of unfortunate scene, right? Elephants feeding at a garbage dump. But there is a lot of interesting backstory to it. When this garbage dump started in this area, all the local people started protesting about it. They wrote petitions to the local collector. They kind of contacted news channels. Nobody wanted a garbage dump. Who wants a garbage dump next? But they weren't able to do anything about it. But the moment elephants started feeding, and we took some of these videos and photos and sent it around, they went kind of viral. The Sun and the Daily Mail in the UK picked it up and said, "Oh, so sad! Indian elephants are eating garbage." And in 3 days, that garbage dump was shut down. Right. So one is elephants in terms of their choice. Were they forced to this garbage dump because they had no other place to eat food? Or was it an active choice that they preferred to eat this garbage over the kind of slightly poorer forage available in the forest? Right? And second is, what is the impact they had? They almost had more agency than all of the local communities who didn't want this and were trying to stop it. The moment the elephants came, it was immediately shut down. So I think, again, this idea of agency is something that we easily understand. And again, going back to the garbage dump is a good case study. This is Silva Monstra, one of the elephants who I'm quite fond of because it's quite close to my house as well. He chose not to go to the garbage. There were 4 tuskers who were routinely going to the garbage dump every day, interacting with people, kind of trying to chase the trucks away, all of this. This guy was around that garbage dump every day, but he never once tried to go in and feed. He just didn't want the hassle of interacting with people that much in that negative kind of way. He was the kind of more habituated males, the fourth category of elephants we named. So he wasn't like, if he was on the side of the road and trucks were driving by him, he wouldn't get agitated at all. If he was in a tea estate and there were a whole lot of people next to him, he would not get agitated. He would calmly continue with what he was doing. But still, he chose, which was a mystery to all of us, never to ever go to the garbage dump and try to feed. So what is going on? If there is such an available, valuable food resource there, why is it that elephants are choosing, or certain individuals are choosing to kind of avoid that? It's an interesting question, but again, coming back to this point of all of these I'm using as case studies to almost illustrate that when you are studying these questions come up, and there are kind of obviously much more complicated answers to it. So you kind of immediately almost agree that elephants have personality and have individual agency. That's barely even a point of discussion. That's something that people inherently agree with, right? The next point is one of cultural learning, or just learning overall, not necessarily only cultural learning. Or how do animals learn? Actually, sorry, I can share my screen again. So the idea of, yeah, I don't know if you all have seen this video, but here is an elephant that learned how to break the fence at the garbage dump, the same place. He learned his tusks don't conduct electricity, and he started breaking the fence. Right, very precise in the way he breaks it. Doesn't pull too hard so the wires don't snap onto his own face. And he very carefully steps over it. Even though there's no wire, he's carefully kind of lifting his feet, making sure he doesn't. Nishant also has some great videos of how they navigate fences. It's kind of quite well known that elephants are able to do amazing things with fences. I have a whole the whole fence case study is amazing. But the question here is that the very next day, 3 other elephants landed up and tried to break the fence. Right? Now, how did they know? Nobody else saw him breaking the fence, and they have a camera trap there. So we know every time the elephants enter, they enter from the gate. So we know every time they entered the garbage dump. They came in, and the first day he experimented with his trunk, the tusks. The first day he didn't really manage to break it. The second day he pushed it down like this, and he broke the fence. And the next day, immediately elephants came. There's another one. This is actually from the WWF camera trap, but we were all working in the same area at that time. Now, this is OVT-8. The first chap was called Alibaba Bashir because he could break any fence. In OVT-8, see, this fence now has been beefed up also. There are tentacles coming straight outwards that don't let you get close. But this fellow's tusks were not long enough, right? So he wasn't able to break it. So he's going around the other side and trying now in different ways. But the thing is, how did he learn that you can use your tusks against the fence? Now, we can't design a robust experiment in the natural sciences to kind of come to terms with this, right? So did the elephant OVT-7, Alibaba Bashir, communicate with all the rest? Listen, guys, I found out this way in which tusks don't conduct. You can break the fence. Or did they see him and kind of imitate that behavior and learn? Now, from this one case study, we are quite sure that none of the other elephants saw him, and we also know elephant sight is very bad. So are elephants able to communicate with each other and pass on behavior? Though we'll never be able to prove this empirically with a rigorous study, I would argue that most people who work with elephants kind of very immediately agree to this idea of elephants being able to pass on knowledge through communication of some form. How they communicate, we don't yet know. And a more fascinating thing is I couldn't pull up the video, unfortunately, because I've been traveling. The day after this, a Makna came also and tried the same, but he didn't have the basic architecture required to pull off this stunt, and he got a bad shock and he left and didn't come back after that. But immediately there were literally two of these and two more other males who all came immediately after the first guy first succeeded, trying to break the fence. So elephants learn in amazing ways, and they forces us to think outside of the boundaries of the formal sciences in terms of how we engage with animal learning. I'm going to end the screen share again. Sorry. Yeah. So it comes up to this whole idea of, I mean, the kind of politics in ecology. I think everybody is familiar with political ecology. It's a kind of huge subfield that is growing that argues that a lot of what happens in ecology is driven by politics. Ecology isn't devoid from politics. And I think that is a really important point that we all agree. And again, in the case of elephants, nobody disagrees, right? There are ministers involved. The deputy chief minister of Karnataka has his mother complaining to him that elephants are walking outside his house. So you see, Karnataka is the most proactive state in the country on trying to deal with conflict. There was an interesting case study when an elephant was going to be captured in 2016. The forest department invited all of us, Nishant as well, another elephant researcher, to come and present what we thought. And basically, three people had got killed in the same week, so you had to do something. You couldn't do anything. And we had kind of narrowed it down to two elephants we thought who could have been responsible. We were not sure. One was a younger male, one was an older male. We suggested video calling the older male and transferring him just about 20 kilometers north into the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. He would probably settle down there and come around. But older males have high sight fidelity, so there's a high chance that he would come back to the area, but we just monitor him closely. The younger male could have dispersed out, so we suggested taking him south of the Palghat Gap and releasing him there because there were much fewer, the male to female ratio was much more skewed. And they listened to us and agreed, and we were amazed. What a great process this is. All of us have a voice at the table. Senior officials have all listened to us. They're going to do this. And the next day morning, the APCCF involved told me, sorry, don't get upset with me, but we decide to capture both elephants, keep them in captivity till after the election, and then we'll decide what to do. Right? And his point was that, see, I know that you think we should decide all this based on science and biology, but the reality is we live in a democratic elected government, and politicians are the ones who decide. So this is how things work. And again, many of us in biology are still slightly upset by it because we feel that we should be the decision makers. We should decide what should be done. But we forget that this whole democratic system, which bureaucrats and others are much more aware of, interestingly, I think is a framework that all of us know. We crib about it, but we know, right? That nothing in ecology is kind of disconnected from politics. So that's the other kind of important point I almost want to coming to the close of what what I've been trying to talk about. So another quick point on the whole idea of subjectivity and objectivity. Many of us try to be very objective in the research we do, particularly in the natural sciences, but in, say, the critical social sciences, you are encouraged to understand your positionality. We're all subjective. There's no way we can get around it. You describe your positionality and describe the lens through which you are viewing the world, or your biases almost. You be upfront about them and then try to mitigate for them in whatever arguments you make later. right? This is the kind of interesting thing. And I think many people in this field would agree, but most traditional natural scientists maybe would not agree. They say, no, no, we should. The idea of collecting data in a rigorous way is to cut out that subjectivity, and we can be completely objective, right? And this is something you hear a lot of people talking about. But if you look at, say, the books of any of the elephant experts, Raman Sukumar or Cynthia Moss or Joyce Poole, Katie Pine, you'll see these very objective papers they've written somewhere, but you'll see these very kind of flowery, verbose books where they throw objectivity out the window entirely. They're completely subjective and very have these deep, meaningful descriptions of how they interacted with animals, how they felt about animals, how some animals made them happy, sad. All of this comes out in their popular literature. So the same human beings are producing slightly disconnected literatures that are quite different from each other. What does that mean as a person? Are they completely objective in the way that they interact with elephants? I'd almost argue not. So again, it's a clear case study of how uh, elephants force us to be open about our subjectivity almost, right? When we engage with them. So I think I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. We can talk through any points that anybody wants, but I kind of end by almost arguing that to me, interdisciplinarity is not about people or nature. It's about the philosophical underpinnings to research and how we approach research, right? And I want to briefly kind of go through four key areas that I think are quite different. One is the whole idea of ontology. Or do you believe everything is absolute and that it can be completely defined? Or do you believe in, so that is the kind of objectivist or objectivism as your ontological stance? Or do you believe in the more kind of constructivism that whatever objects exist in the world depend on how they are constructed and who views them? So different people view the same thing, they will have different ideas about what that thing is. But the same thing can be different in different scenarios, right? Your ontological position for research in terms of how you define what you're trying to study itself can be quite different. Next is theory. This whole idea of that deductive reasoning and testing a hypothesis is something that is quite regular in the natural sciences. But in the social sciences, you could study elephants only to use elephants as a way to think about ourselves. You see the Jamie Lorimer's and the Man Baruas actually doing it. Man's paper on cosmopolitanism, for example, is using elephants as a case study and arguing that the idea of cosmopolitanism has to be extended to the non-human. Right? That is his paper, his thesis of that paper. Cosmopolitanism being that we don't kind of associate rigidly with national borders or identity, and we think of ourselves as very global, borderless kind of people. And he argues that we think that this is a uniquely human kind of idea, but here he's giving with examples of elephants. We to extend this to elephants as well. So the idea is, if he's not really studying elephants, he's using elephants to advance theory and thinking in human beings. So again, deductive being kind of testing hypothesis, or inductive in trying to generate new theory, right? That's the second axis along which I feel we should kind of divide and better understand research. And the third is epistemology, which broadly kind of I describe along the lines of positivist and post-positivist. By positivist, I mean where you do this whole slightly the scientific loop of you collect empirical data, try to run some analysis on it, and based on that, you generate new knowledge. And you reject knowledge outside of this loop. I think that for me is important. Many of us can be positivists, but we also kind of agree with traditional ecological knowledge or post-positivist forms of knowledge, other forms of knowing. Are we accepting of it or not? And finally, yeah, the more easy approach is data, qualitative versus quantitative. How we deal with this is a key difference. But in all of this, I end by almost thinking that the way forward is for us to think and kind of engage as interdisciplinary people to be good at one thing we do because we may be trained in that, we have experience in that, but be open to other forms of knowing, other approaches to research, and don't kind of shut them out. A very good example, again, I'll give with people is, so one of my anthropology supervisors in the UK, he had a leg problem, and I kept telling him he used to keep popping ibuprofen. I kept telling him, see, that ibuprofen is not going to help you. It's going to damage your kidneys and all that in the long term. You're only suppressing the pain. I'll put you in touch with some Ayurvedic people, and you try an alternative system. Because it was I mean, he had been to the NHS and all kinds of doctors. There was no real solution in the Western system. And he, an anthropologist who was very post-positivist in his research and his worldview and how he tried to understand the world professionally, personally completely rejected it it's all some mumbo jumbo nonsense. What is the Ayurveda you go on about? Like, it's ridiculous, right? But there's another person I know who's a very positivist, um, kind of animal researcher, I would say, who kind of takes homeopathy regularly. I don't have the permission of that person to say who it is. Right? But when he first told me this, I was quite shocked. How do you reconcile that? Where you're very rigid in the way you study animals, but you're quite happy with taking homeopathy, which has no scientific basis at all. So I'll almost argue that it's not that all of us should start taking homeopathy or kind of embrace homeopathy, but we should not be disrespectful of others who believe in it. I think that is the key to kind of being able to collaborate and think out of the box and work more closely together on these interdisciplinary areas. And I feel elephants are a key factor in kind of bringing all this together. Anybody who studies elephants is very open to all of this, and because they're very visible, a lot of these debates are also kind of permeating into other spheres. Maybe others who work on other species will disagree and think other species are as important. But yeah, I think I'll kind of end there. I really hope that we can all work more closely together as interdisciplinary people who are respectful of each other's ways of knowing, and try to bring those together rather than kind of pit them against each other. Thanks. We'll now kind of see if there are any discussions and things to talk about.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk, Tarsh.
Thanks,
I
Ravi.
actually have a point to bring up myself as well. This is just a thought that I had while listening to you. I feel like it's far simpler to see the social behavior of elephants, and I feel like when we study elephants, that gives us an avenue to start talking about other creatures and coexistence with other animals as well. Because it's very easy for people to notice the way that elephants interact with humans in an intellectual capacity because they are a relatively smart species. So that's just something that I thought of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of cognition, a lot has been written about this in terms of elephant cognition. It's not just elephants, it's also maybe dolphins,
Hmm.
corvids, octopus. Many species are quite amazing in uh, their kind of cognitive capability and how they kind of engage with us at that level. Personally, I don't know why tigers are so hyped. Like, you see a tiger, it'll either be sleeping or it'll be attacking some prey or it'll be doing something quite irrelevant. But you watch an elephant, it'll never ignore you. Even if it's ignoring you, you know it's choosing to ignore you and pretending that it's ignoring you and not noticing you, right? There is that constant engagement with human beings, which makes it fascinating. I think all these species, what they do is they kind of immediately open up this idea that it's a spectrum. We cannot even say these four elephants are higher levels of cognition, so we have to treat them differently, and then everything else is different. That spectrum is immediately opened up by these very large charismatic animals, which I think is very exciting.
I believe Ravi has a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead, Ravi.
Thanks, Tarsh. Very thought-provoking and a wide sweep. Um, your reference to, the elephant researchers and how they write hardcore, depersonalized research papers, and when they write books, there's more of a relationship with the animals and animal personalities. I don't think that's unique to elephants. If you read stuff written about tigers, lions, the literature I'm kind of familiar with, you see that disconnect more or less. Cheetahs also. So it requires long-term watching of animals. Sitting behind a computer screen, GPS data is not going to give you that experience to begin with. And increasingly, that's where field research is going now, right? Most researchers spend less and less time in the field, and the funding system, all of that is also kind of geared towards that, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
But I just wanted to bring up the point that elephants, yes, much longer lived, and hence you kind of track their lives for longer periods. Much of the other mammals are going to be much shorter lived. Effectively, a large cat at best is going to be, what, 12, 14 years, nothing more than that. But they do, if you read the literature carefully, they are expressing personal feelings and personalities of these animals also.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ravi. I agree. I was kind of overstating the whole elephant case there. And it's not that I don't like tigers. I'm quite happy to see a tiger as well. But I agree with you. I feel like it is spot on, even if this is satellite coloring, which is the norm now. Nobody actually even watches an elephant, which is really sad. It's like that rich knowledge and this engagement with all the complexity around it will only happen when you're out there in the field. And it is really sad that less and less people want to do it. But again, for me, what's exciting in that is that we are forced to do this in India, right? Even if you live at the edge of Bangalore, you're going to see elephants. So it's not that this almost interaction is not limited to biologists who go to these faraway spaces and study animals. And sorry, Rana, before I come to you, just kind of add another really fascinating point. There's a really great book by Michael Lewis called Inventing Global Ecology. He quotes you, Ravi, in that, and he studies many of the ecologists of that time, Raman Sukumar, Madhav Gadgil, AJT Johnson, Christy Williams, and his argument there is that many of these people were trained in America in how you kind of study animals in pristine spaces. When they came back to India, they found people also existing in these spaces, and they wrote people back into ecology. They brought people back into ecology. That is what is inventing global ecology. They wrote the people back, right? Now, I would argue that it happened actually subconsciously. They didn't actively say that, okay, there's a problem that ecology is devoid of humans and we have to bring the human back in. It was just the reality of their field sites that brought the human back in. And my hope is that with our generation, we can do it more actively. We can kind of engage with these ideas. Not that all of us has to do everything, but can we build stronger collaborations to better study these socio-ecological systems with rigor of both the natural and the social sciences? Thanks. Rana, did you want to add something?
Yeah, but I wanted to bring in two issues which are related. When you brought in multidisciplinarity, for me, multidisciplinarity is also, of course, I completely agree with the perspective that you took of how we look at the social sciences and their perspectives and bring that in. Of course, we do. But for me, methodologies become very important. And I think one of the major limiting features of the natural sciences, and I will say that the way I have studied monkeys for close to 30 years, is that I was completely bound by methods that claimed to be objective, that were perhaps objective in some ways, perhaps not in every way, but which were very restrictive in the way we understand the lives of other individuals, right? And that could be human or non-human. And now, of course, I'm experimenting with not only what we call qualitative methods, such as ethnographies, which also talk about much more deeper, longer term engagement in terms of observations, but also getting into certain methods which many researchers will not even recognize as methods, which is, for example, attunement, right? Or engagement, which comes even pre-cognitively through affect, right? And it is true that when I'm with my macaques, just as you are with your elephants, there are affective relationships that develop and which we cannot always verbalize. But can these relationships, and which touches upon what you mentioned, the positionality of our own positionality as researchers, do those methods, whether they get published in a journal or not, do they tell us a lot more about other beings? And I think now I've reached a stage in my life, career, whatever, they're intermixed, where I think these methods have become very important for me. And where I'm trying to be, if I may be very presumptive, I'm trying to be the other being. I'm trying to look at it. And in that sense, I think the lions that Ravi studied in Gir, or the elephants that you've been studying in Gudalur, or the wasps that Raghavendra studies, all become important in their own right. Because if you want to look at it as other individuals see it, it's as complex as it can get within the realms of your own world, of your universe. And that, in that sense, I think no life, no behavior, no activity, no cognitive expression is boring, right? It's boring because the tiger may not match up to our ideas of complex existence, which an elephant does. And that's why I would like to think that, to me, even the growth of a fungus perhaps is as exciting as the movement of an elephant or the grooming that a macaque exhibits towards another individual. So I just wanted to bring in that aspect of interdisciplinarity, which I think so science about, and I think the French philosophers like Bruno Latour, Vincent Desprez, or Florence Bounoy have talked about these. They've talked about these methods 30, 40 years ago, except that they were never considered academic enough, which I completely agree with, that we have our own definitions of academics and we stick to it. But I would really like to encourage young researchers who are being with other beings, and I will not say species, just being with other beings, to actually explore these other very unorthodox, scientifically unorthodox approaches and methodologies, if your goal is to really understand that. Sorry, I've said enough. Thanks.
Thanks, Sona. Yeah, absolutely. That is a great point. I fully agree. I thought going into attunement and affect would be a bit too much. I'm not sure I fully understand the concepts either. I'm not sure I understand anything, but I'm more familiar, less comfortable with some concepts. But I totally agree. There's an interesting story I remember being told by Niva Nambudri, who's one of the first women mahouts in Kerala, about a mahout who was trampled by an elephant, and the tusker had blood on his tusk and was totally going on the rampage, but suddenly stopped. And the senior mahout came, put his hand on the elephant, and calmly moved him back in. Right? And everyone was in shock. How did that senior mahout know that that elephant was not going to interact with him? Is no way we can put our finger on it. And I have colleagues who, when we identify elephants, four of my
Absolutely.
colleagues were all Betikurumbas, who would see an elephant and say CMK1 or OVMK3. And I would say, how do you know? Please show me a photograph of the year or show me something. Don't just say it's this elephant. But they knew first and they found the sign later. Right? And that is attunement, where you actually see an elephant and you know which individual it is without, like if you see your relative walking somewhere far in a crowd, you won't try
Yes.
to look for some physically distinguishing features. You will know it's that person. Right? But
Correct.
how do you do that? I think we have not got to that yet. And I think it's vital for us who are kind of spending time with these animals to engage with these more. Because as much as I admire the human geographers and the Bruno Latours and the Vivian Desprez of the world, they don't actually engage with these at all. These are only philosophical concepts that kind of rattle around in these ivory towers, unfortunately. Right? Aman Barua is an exception. He has spent a lot of time there. But they will talk about companionship and all these ideas without actually spending time. And the people who are spending the time and who know these ideas intuitively are unfortunately not writing about them or even engaging with people who like that vocabulary and write about it in this way. So I am really keen that um, the kind of people now engaging directly with elephants think about these deeper ideas, not just elephants, all species, as you think, as you rightly say, kind of take a more than human or a multi-species approach in methodology. I didn't use the term methodology, but I think when I talk about approach to research, I am roughly talking about methodology as the underlying kind of bedrock based on which you build your research. So yeah, I have to say I'm very excited about the prospects of what India can contribute because we are just forced to interact with animals so much more than anyone else in the world. Thanks. Anybody else?
I think Vinay has a question in the chat box.
Political ecology. Yeah, I mean, one of the critiques of political ecology is that it's all political and not ecological anymore. So it's basically because you're trying to establish the field. You're trying to say that ecology is influenced by politics. Okay, we know that. Now what next, right? Whether the Shoriga can burn is a political question. It's not about the ecology of whether that grass is actually going to be benefited by that Shoriga burning. So I think this is the problem. And again, it's two things. It's that why isn't political ecology becoming a part of, say, conservation practice or policy and things like that? Is because nobody's trying to kind of push it in really. Though politics is very much there. It's not all policies kind of revolve around politics. I think, yeah, it's a hard question, but it also goes back to that point, that kind of idea I mentioned about Chris Sandbrook and Bill Adams' paper on the objectives of social science research. It's very often not to aid the practice of conservation. Like there are many social scientists who don't necessarily want to say, I want to save that elephant or save BRT or restore or save the elephant, or whatever. They are looking at a social process and studying it to understand it better. That's it. So they're just happy with almost critiquing the process of conservation, which I think is fair enough. I don't think we need to kind of get upset with them and say, you come and you also do the same practice as me, and only then you can criticize. I think it's okay for others to kind of look at what we are doing, criticize what we are doing, and step out. Like we criticize, say, what politicians are doing. Inherently, all of us criticize many different things around the world, even if it's not in the formal way, without actually being a part of that practice. And I think that is a general human thing. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. Um, we all get upset by it a lot because it's very critical of most things in conservation, but I think that's okay.
I believe we have another question by Tansu in the chat.
Yeah. Um, so on this whole idea of conflict, to me, what actually happens in terms of how many people die and how many elephants get killed is almost secondary. This is a very controversial thing to say, but I just feel that we're never going to reach a position where no elephant or no human is killed. When you live in a shared space, there is an element of danger. That will come up and down based on a whole lot of variables, but you live a little more fearfully, and there is a slight greater risk involved in that landscape. So what happens um, is that elephants do get killed occasionally in electrocution. There isn't too much retaliatory killing. That's something to watch out for, because that is again becomes a kind of political thing almost, right? So people aren't killing elephants in a retaliatory way, but people are getting killed. Elephants are getting killed. It goes up and down quite a bit. For me, the perception of how people feel about it is more interesting or more important almost. Like, if a certain person is okay with getting killed, again, this is a very controversial thing to say. No, nobody is fully okay with getting killed, but there's a spectrum, and some communities are more accepting of death than others. If you look at the Jain communities, for example, and this whole practice of Thekaekara, uh, a good friend made a whole video about it, that human beings decide it's time to go and they kind of fast unto death and go, right? The modern kind of medical system trying to battle death rather than promote good health is a problem, I think. And this idea that death is something completely unnatural and everybody should live till 80 years old is a problem. So, yeah, I mean, where am I going with this? Like, there are places in the country where there are a minimal number of people getting killed, elephants getting killed, and that's okay. Uh, there are places where there are a lot of people and elephants comparatively getting killed, and that's not okay. Take Wayanad, for example, the numbers in absolute terms of human deaths and elephant deaths and crop damage is minimal compared to North Bengal. But it's such a huge political problem in Wayanad, and things are so antagonistic, and people are so polarized, and there's so much conflict among themselves. It is no longer about the elephants. Um, so yeah, I don't think that you can actually I don't think it's worth trying to estimate how much conflict there is based on the numbers. It's how much conservation conflict or social conflict there is on account of negative interactions between people and animals that is more important. And it's not an easy thing to keep track of or kind of deal with, but that is the reality.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tarsh, for that. Yeah.
Great. Shall we wrap up?
Yes.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing talk, Tarsh.
Thanks.
I'm even more excited to work with you now. I'm gonna keep on picking your brain about these things, and like it was just genuinely very interesting. And to
Yeah.
everyone who joined it, thank you for being here. I'll share our socials on the chat box. This talk will be uploaded on YouTube by tomorrow morning. And if you want to reference it or talk about it or share it around, you can do it through our YouTube.
Yeah.
So yeah, just keep stay tuned to our socials. And we hope to see you for our next talk as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again,
Thanks,
Tarsh.
Varun. So quickly,
Yeah.
everyone, though, I mean, Varun also, rather than just upload this talk, like I feel
hmm
nobody listens to 1 hour talks.
hmm
Something we're trying to do, Rana, Ravi in particular, everybody else, is to cut up talks into smaller digestible segments
Oh,
that
definitely. Yeah.
helps with the key ideas. So I mean, you can upload the whole talk. I have no objection to it. But I'm
Hmm.
happy to spend some time thinking through whoever, I don't know, somebody found that was an interesting thing. Can we say that in 3 minutes? So that anybody
Hmm.
can quickly kind of get a handle on that. With Rana, particularly a lot of your work, I think it would be great if we could think about some time where you're
Sure.
okay to bring out these little bite-sized videos, 5 minutes maybe, that
Sure.
touch on one concept. So people can pick up on little concepts over time, because
That's very
that's all
nice.
attention people in the digital age have. So this is something
That's
that
very
we want to
nice.
start working on in comms. Let's do it. I'm happy to use my talk as a guinea pig almost to see what we can cut up certain
Sure,
key
sure,
ideas
sure.
and publish
Be
those.
very happy. And we could also have responses. We could even have
Absolutely.
responses to them so that
Yeah.
it becomes so, when
Yeah.
you're looking at one of these bite-sized presentations, you get a quick glimpse into how there could be
Absolutely.
other views that contribute to that
Yeah.
central view that we're talking about.
Great.
Definitely,
Okay
definitely.
then.
I'll coordinate with you about this. So
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
See you then.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
See
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Tarsh. Thanks very much once again.
Thanks, everyone. See you.